fiscal sponsorship through the Study Center, and we're kind of moving into the next phase to launch this here in San Francisco. So I thought this was a great beginning slide. This is right after the earthquake. Here's 5,000 small cottages that house 16,000 residents. So this is interesting because in a state of emergency, we find ways to create solutions. So St. Francis Village is named after our namesake. I love this quote that he has. Start by doing what's necessary, then what's possible, and suddenly you're doing the impossible. So this, for us, is very much about acknowledging that there's an issue in the city and trying to be innovative and find a solution. So we've been working with David Campos' office, and he's been quite a champion as far as I'm concerned around homelessness issues. And most recently, he's actually declared it a state of emergency. If you've been on Division Street, you've seen that there's been a lot of tents that have kind of been erupting. I'm friends with a woman who's actually crowdfunding that effort to provide tents, which has become kind of a controversial issue. But it's great that David's stepping up and saying, hey, listen, it's time for the city to think about real solutions to this because what we're seeing here is just untenable. So just there's a lot of history around homelessness. I'd say it's probably been predominantly in San Francisco for about the last 30 years. I think it's interesting to kind of take a look at, I believe Newsom started in around 2004 and he called the 10-year plan. And his estimation was that he could get rid of homelessness in 10 years if they approached it strategically and they implemented a lot of different policies. Interestingly, they said they had this approach which was like, hey, listen, it's actually, the math adds up. It's a lot cheaper for us to just pay to house our residents in permanent housing than it is to continue to treat them on the street. And I'll talk about another project that's actually done that successfully. That's been their plan. They just haven't been able to execute on it for a variety of different reasons. So from this graph, you can see that homelessness has actually kind of stayed steady over the last 15 years. With between 5,000 and 8,000 people on the streets. The city spends about $165 million a year on homelessness. The interesting thing is in the past 10 years, we've housed 11,000 people, and we've used the Homeward Bound program to send about 8,000 of those home. So, over the last 10 years, this program where we're spending this money has gotten us permanent housing for about 20,000 people living on the streets of San Francisco, which is, no small feat. I just want to take you through some statistics from the point in time count just to get a sense of the landscape of homelessness here in San Francisco. I thought this was interesting just to kind of get a sense of how it's changing. And then you can see how many are sheltered and unsheltered. So there's roughly breaks down to about half. So you have about 3,000 people who are sleeping and living on the streets and about 3,000 who are in the shelter system. So this was really interesting to me because it's kind of a myth to debunk, which is that most homeless people in San Francisco aren't residents. In fact, 71% of people in San Francisco who are homeless are actually are from San Francisco, and about 50% of them have been living in San Francisco for 10 years. So I just wanted to kind of quickly just show what it looks like in terms of reasons why people are homeless: job loss, alcohol and drug use, eviction, arguments with family, and divorce and separation. I threw this in because it shows District 6, which stands out pretty clearly. So 4,100, or almost 4,200 of the sheltered and unsheltered homeless folks are in District 6, which kind of blows all the other districts out of the water. Obstacles to obtaining employment. So I put this in here because I think it's really interesting that not having a permanent address is such a key issue and something that I've heard come up again and again, and I'm going to speak to that later, so I just wanted to kind of call it out. health conditions, so a lot of these are what leads to what I'm going to be talking about in a little bit about people who are chronically homeless. So some of the most severe cases of homelessness, and in my estimation, the issues that need to kind of be dealt with first are around people who have some of these more serious issues. So you can see kind of how it breaks out in terms of PTSD and veterans and psychiatric conditions and physical disabilities and chronic health problems, which is, again, just interesting to understanding the landscape. So we can see a lot of people are sleeping outside as well as in shelters. So this became really interesting and started to kind of inform the direction that I was taking too, which is that 80% of homeless folks on the street are kind of in this transitional phase. So again, it's another subset that we felt like we could offer this as a solution and say like, okay, well, what if we provided transitional housing? Would there actually be a need for it? And when you look at the breakout, you realize there's actually a pretty high need for this short-term, in-term supported housing. So that kind of got us thinking.
I'm struggling to see.
Yeah, is that because I'm standing in the way, or because
Yes.
it's kind of small?
I
Let's see if I can, is that better?
that works.
Cool, all right. So one of the other things that I wanted to kind of just talk about was this idea of the shelter system, I think, is kind of broken. So I think there's a real need. I've talked to and done a lot of interviews with folks who have, kind of severe safety concerns, and in fact, a lot of folks that I've talked to actually choose to sleep on the streets over staying in the shelter system. And all that aside, we only have one, for every 5 homeless folks, there's only 1 shelter spot available. So that's clearly an issue too. One of the other things about the shelter system is there's really not supported services. So a lot of the folks who are in the shelter system, when they come out of the shelter at the end of the evening, or in the morning the next day rather, there's not supportive services to help them kind of transition, and that's also become an issue that is part of the system failure that I've seen and hope to address. So I'm not sure if, show of hands, how many people have heard of the Navigation Center? Awesome, okay, cool. Wow, so there's fairly
The one on
important.
Stevenson, right?
I'm sorry?
On Stevenson Street?
No, it's on Mission between 14th and 15th.
Oh, that one.
Yeah, it's that old school. So I spent about 6 months there doing an ethnography, interviewing folks, became friendly with their executive director, Julie, and she kind of put out a bunch of reports that I thought were fascinating. It was highly successful. So this graph, which is really hard to read on the left, is basically just saying that 83% of folks that went into the Navigation Center had a successful exit. They left and went into some kind of permanent housing. So really great success rate. One of the reasons for that is they all have personal support case managers who help them literally navigate the system. The cool thing about the Navigation Center that is different than the shelter system is it has the 3 Ps, pets, partners, and possessions. So that's kind of an innovation. The one thing that's kind of missing that I'll again talk about later is this idea of privacy, and something that actually became somewhat of a problem. One of the reasons that folks got kicked out just because of a lot of tensions that arose because of people sleeping in these kind of clustered grouped rooms. The other thing with the Navigation Center, not to be a naysayer, I think it's great. I'm excited to hear about more of them, but it's also been really expensive. In fact, almost twice the amount of what the kind of current system offers. So I want to talk a little bit about innovation. I think that this is a really interesting example. This is the Salt Lake City example. Salt Lake City was in the news recently because they basically were touted as moving all of their homeless folks into permanent housing because they did the math, and the math said it's actually cheaper to just give them permanent housing. The issue here in San Francisco is housing was a lot more expensive, so that's not really an option for us. But what this study kind of taught me was that one of the most important things was, and as evidenced by this case, they still have 14,000 homeless people in the state of Utah, but they cleared up almost all of the chronic homelessness. So that was a really big kind of approach to saying, like, let's tackle this like core subset, these individuals who aren't just transitioning in and transitioning out. And that's something that we'll see here in San Francisco too. There's always kind of people that fall in hard times or get evicted, they're homeless for a few months, and then they land on their feet or they use their support system and they kind of get back into permanent housing. Whereas the chronic homeless they're just out of luck. They have no options, and that has been what's making it really difficult for us to provide solutions. Is just this idea of like, how do we approach that issue? So Utah did it well. One of the solutions that, the solution that I've come to was really well informed by this book, Tent City Urbanism. If you're interested in the issue, it's an awesome read. It's basically a variety of case studies on Dignity Village and Opportunity Village and a lot of different encampment communities that have emerged over the last 10 years or so kind of around the country. So just wanted to bring it up. So Dignity Village is over here on the left. I have been getting advised by one of the folks on the staff there and actually took a trip up there and visited and learned a lot of really interesting things, just how they're actually selling firewood. So they're in the black, so they're a self-sustaining, autonomous, self-regulated community. They're considered transitional, so they're given about 2 years to stay there, and then folks have to leave. But it was just really cool to go up there. They have community gardens, they have a woodworking shop. You just got the sense that it was home for a lot of people, and the folks that I did speak to up there expressed that sentiment too. So that really got me thinking, like, why can't we think about creating something similar down here? On the right is Opportunity Village. I just love this quote. They're also called a transitional micro-housing community. Opportunity Village was a stepping stone for my transition back into society. After only a few months of living there with my girlfriend, and I are now living a life we're able to sustain a home on our own after being homeless for 2 years. So again, it just provided that community and infrastructure for them to get out of homelessness. There's a lot of really cool innovation here in San Francisco. Bavame, Hand Up, the Pit Stop, really cool things. The other thing I wanted to bring up was just this idea of parklets. I think it's really cool that the city kind of just started testing out something new, and residents were receptive to it. And what started out as this like kind of grassroots movements where a bunch of guys were kind of like, we're going to reclaim parking spaces, and we're just going to set something up, and we're going to pay the meter all day, and we're going to say, like, why can't we turn this parking space into something other than what's used for a car, was incredibly refreshing, and now our entire city is littered with these wonderful parklets. And so, again, I'm just thinking in that mindset when I approach this project in terms of being innovative and thinking about alternatives to help, correct the problem that we're currently in. This other kind of intersection that I want to kind of conclude with is driven by the tiny house movement. And really what I think is most important there is that space is becoming harder and harder to come by. There's more and more debt. It's harder to get a mortgage. A lot of folks these days live in tiny homes, and they're wealthy, and they have the means to buy larger houses, but they want to downsize. And so a lot of kind of naysayers say, hey, there's these tiny homes, why do you want to put homeless people into like large dog houses or coffins? And it could be valid, but my kind of response to that is, living in a tiny home is actually a dignified solution, and there's a lot of people staying in tiny homes who choose to do that. So I see it as, again, a totally reasonable option that's not subhuman really in any way. There's been 2 guys who've done it really well. This guy Elvis in LA raised like 80 grand on Kickstarter, and he rolled out a whole bunch of these. Same with Greg, he's right here in Oakland. He rolled out a whole bunch of these, and then quickly got into issues with like public works and the city kind of like just seeing these things erupt and being kind of floating all around the street. And so again, our solution is reacting to that and kind of saying like, all right, like do we want to just have these tiny homes kind of floating all around the city, or do we want to think a little bit more cohesively and strategically about it? So the other key component, the map on the left, again, kind of hard to see, but all the blips are underutilized land, either residential or commercial vacant plots of land. We have a few different kind of maps and heat maps like this that say that there's actually quite a few opportunities where developers are kind of dragging their feet. They're not slotted to break land for like another 2 years or so. Why can't we use that land and kind of potentially think about providing housing solutions that are very short term? How are we doing on time? I just want to make sure we're not.
Well,
All right, we're about 2/3 of the way through. The other really funny thing was just this idea of like, hey, vacant lots are being turned into urban farms and residents are being given tax breaks to do that, right? So like if we can use our vacant lots for urban farms to help the community, why can't we help the homeless community with vacant lots?
Yeah,
So here's my very, very, very poorly drawn Venn diagram that I put together very quickly. I apologize. There's an intersection point in there somewhere. It's a little bit hard to see, but St. Francis Village is at that intersection of kind of what I just took you through, which is tiny home movement, the fact that we're in a state of emergency and have an opportunity to innovate, the fact that the shelter system is broken and needs to change, this idea of the navigation center being successful but potentially can be evolved, and then taking advantage of underutilized land. So that brings us to St. Francis Village. This is a preliminary rendering. I'm actually working with an artist to do some more professional renderings, but the idea I'll take you through here in a little bit. So the idea of St. Francis Village mission to develop and pilot sleep and service villages for 10 M-house residents that provide a minimum of secure sleep, 24 access to toilets, storage, trash disposal, site coordination, and partnered connection to case management for each person staying at the community. The reason why we think it's really important is because it provides dignity, autonomy, and opportunity. Those are the kind of the key things that we want to focus on it providing. The way we want to achieve that is through fostering kind of a tiny home community where folks get to make their own decisions about how it's run, by making sure that everyone who's in the program has a case manager to help them in their transition from the streets to this village into permanent housing. We plan to provide restroom, storage, showers, and trash, so that's a healthy living environment. And of course, we want it to be really, when I say longer term, around anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, so that people aren't like they are now, kind of moved around day to day, cited for violations, ticketed and fined and criminalized for being homeless. So here's a quick budget. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You guys take a photo, or this is our base amount, which is essentially pretty close to $5,000 to get the project started. Most of the salary would be going to the on-site coordinator to kind of be managing the environment there and managing folks who are living there. And then, as you can see, case management is the most crucial part, but it doesn't have a line item, and that's because we're in talks and partnering with local nonprofits who would be basically providing those case management services. The porta potties and garbage and recycling, are kind of obvious. So the one-time, and by the way, those were the monthly costs. The one-time setup cost between $6,000 and $9,000, really $6,000, $9,000 if we wanted to do solar. To have some kind of electricity, we found that charging devices like phones are really crucial, so we wanted to put it on there, but it depends on fundraising. So I actually I didn't include a picture, but I built one of these units with supplies from Home Depot for $200. And it's built off of pallets. So we're kind of getting those pallets donated, and then we're using kind of minimal materials. And we've been able to create these housing solutions for an extremely cost-effective rate. And they're waterproof, they're lockable, they have a window. The one I have now has like a fold-down desk, so very livable and sleepable. You can't stand up in it. Really, it's meant for sleeping. If you want to change in it, if you want to use the desk, maybe, but it's fairly small. So just kind of where we are in terms of the actual project. We've been working closely with the city. We realized that that's really important. We just met with the Department of Planning. Turns out that there's specific zones that in San Francisco will only allow for housing. So we were kind of, sheltered and homeless housing. So originally we were reaching out to landowners kind of all over San Francisco, just approaching them, cold calling them. But if they're not in an area that's zoned for homeless shelters, that became an issue. So we've just been making sure that everything is kind of buttoned up in terms of how we approach this and collaborate with the city. Because we realize if the city's not on board, it's going to be really difficult to launch. This is my appeal to say, if you know of a vacant plot of land that might be a possibility, or somebody who would be potentially interested in getting a tax break for donating a plot of land that they have, we could talk about size and other requirements, but that is the phase that I'm currently in terms of searching for a viable option to do this. We've been doing a lot of community outreach. We've been doing talks in other neighborhoods to kind of understand how this could potentially work, and there's obviously a lot of concerns with residents around safety. But those, again, are things that I feel like once we've started to really have discussions with neighbors and, again, start to let people understand those issues and how a lot of these folks are neighbors and people who have lived here in San Francisco, that alleviates a lot of the issues that we've been running into. Then we're doing, obviously, fundraising and partner development. Eventually, we'd like to look at these villages and say, hey, this is just a pilot project, but is it possible to scale it up and actually provide solutions? So if there are literally right now 3,000 folks who are sleeping on the street every night, what would it take in terms of space requirements? Like let's say we had a village closer to Dignity Village where there was 50 people, and we were able to get them into something where they had safe sleep for an interim time while they were looking for permanent housing. So I guess the thought there is, do we want to have like hundreds of these with only 10 people in it, and how difficult would that be to manage versus if we kind of scale it up and have a larger number of people? And one of the findings with the navigation center is once you get over kind of like 60 people or so, things just start to kind of become, it's like a tipping point where things just become like a more disjointed community. Everyone doesn't know everyone. Voting and meetings become more difficult. So again, just the learning that I've come across. And then I think this is kind of the last slide, just kind of this idea of like, what's the longer term vision here? And this is a really interesting one for me too, which, yeah, we obviously, if we had permanent housing, that's ideal. That's what we all want. We all want permanent housing, but that's going to take a long time to build. We don't have funding at the federal level, so like, what's Jerry Brown doing? Why don't we have federal funding to do this? So that's a question we should all be asking of our state and federal government. How can we kind of think about this in terms of preventative measures? What do we do to keep folks from becoming homeless to begin with? For those people who have addictions and mental illness, there's solutions. For people who are experiencing poverty, there's other solutions. This other idea that I've been exploring a lot lately is basic income. It's been gaining a lot of traction. Does anyone here know what basic income is?
Guaranteed income by the government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
sort of like what Switzerland just turned down.
Exactly.
Just turned
So
down.
that sign is actually from the movement in Switzerland. It's in Alaska. The Permanent Fund is doing it. So every resident in Alaska currently receives, I think, $1,500 every year. And when you turn 65, you get Social Security. So what would our country look like if every resident received a basic income, and how might that be a solution to provide an answer to income inequality and solving some of these poverty issues. The two bottom pictures, this guy Patrick Kennedy runs an organization called the Panoramic. He's working with these units that snap together. They're micro units. I believe it's 165 square feet. It has a kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom.
Can you stand up inside them?
I'm sorry?
Can you stand up inside of them?
Yes, you can stand
That's-
up. They're totally legitimate apartments. They're a lot more expensive, but they could be an option for the city to fund that is considerably less expensive than building traditional housing. Again, there's a whole bunch of issues, like these are fabricated in China, and the unions don't want to use, products and labor that come. So we've been exploring like lots of alternatives and running up to challenges and obstacles in all different ways. But again, this is a really interesting idea. If you look at the picture on the right, this thing kind of snaps apart and snaps back together. So again, we've been just exploring lots of different ideas and alternatives. I think that's it. Yeah, that's the last slide. So, sorry, I hope it wasn't too long, but I'd love to take questions.
Okay, 5 questions. Susan?
Yeah, is there a way of working with the HUD or something to allow people to move in with other people, like sign a waiver or something?
You're talking about in the shelter system.
Well, the shelter system, this is just individual people. Can bring someone into their home for temporarily, because right now we've got this problem as people are out on the street waiting to get into homes that, they'll wait for 3 years, 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And, where do they go while they're waiting for a home?
Mm-hmm.
And,
I think what she's trying to get at is that there are homeless people and there are people that are housed and they're not allowed to have roommates because the unit says only 1 person per unit. And these are HUD requirements or other kind of restrictions on the housing that they obtain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another way to house people if people are willing to have roommates.
Right.
Because then you have shared expenses instead of only 1 person having all the household expenses.
So I don't know if I can provide an exact answer to that question, but I know that there's legislation being explored to do things like, for instance, garage conversions, and how do we kind of get around traditional permitting. So like you could potentially convert a garage for $15K to make it into a livable unit, but current zoning and permitting requires you to spend upwards of $150K. And so those are some of the things that we also kind of looked into.
Another question really quick. How can a person get a case manager without signing up with somebody that wants to take all their money?